Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and D Podcast 1991 Retrospective, where we cover records that came out in the year 1991. They're going to be turning, damn, Saoirse, they're going to be turning 30 this year. And we are going to be covering today, this week, we're covering Primal... Oh.
I thought I was going to lose my balance there for a second.
Oh, okay. We'll be covering Primal Scream's Screamadelica unless we fall out of our chairs and break our necks collectively, which is a possibility here at the Jams D Podcast.
That's my favorite Napalm Death record.
Can one just, if you didn't see our episode last week talking about Talk's Laughing Stock, go please check that out. Watch me fall asleep live and on air as Tyler captures in startling detail. But August and him do have a fantastic discussion over that album and its narrative. It's a very, very good episode. And then if you check it out, please come back here and listen to us talk about psychedelic rock.
I mean, look, there's a lot of genre labels.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, there's a lot of genres you can throw into this motherfucker.
And the particular genre fusion of this album actually has its own label, which is in relation to bands that have preceded it. In fact, it's kind of not a perfect example of this, but it's often cited as an example of Madchester music, which is music that sort of rock music in Manchester and in that particular area of the UK in the late 80s and early 90s that fused more psychedelic and dance elements into the sound. Obviously, the biggest Manchester band are the Stone Roses, who obviously were much more into the sort of psychedelic side of things rather than the dance side of things, but there was certainly elements of all of that in there as well.
If the Happy Monday's probably the most famous dance.
Happy Mondays too.
Manchester band. Like the Primal Scream are in here as much of their attitude as their musical genre cocktail.
But this is still like cited as one of the most sort of important records to come out of that era and sound and location, and certainly one of the most influential as well. And a lot of that is to do with the specific a couple of specific people, a couple of specific collaborators on this record. So first of all, Primal Scream were, at the time that this record came out, they were a relatively new band. They're a rock and roll band. You can hear a lot of their rock and roll roots in this record and in the record that follows it, Give Out But Don't Give Up, which is a much more kind of conventional heartland rock album than this. But this was a record where they teamed up deliberately with the producers Andrew Weatherall and Terry Farley. And Andrew Weatherall in particular, one of the most influential acid house DJ producers of his time, went on to be behind the boards on a number of significant, weird, esoteric, psychedelic, and acid house, dance, all these kinds of like important sort of fringe electronic / rock artists and bands. He was remixed the Happy Mondays, I think, as well, like more of a DJ than a producer, but his role in this as a producer on this record is integral because Primal Scream did not develop this new sound entirely as a band. This record is the product of this intense collaboration of Primal Scream crafting these songs and then handing them to Weatherall and Farley adding this, at the time, culturally rising elements of dub music, of house music, of all of these fringe electronic club UK music scenes and infusing them into these broadly rock arrangements. And so there's this transmogrification of the style that has led to this incredibly unique and genre-bending album that is probably one of the most acclaimed records of its time in its particular niche. Like, this record was universally lauded when it came out, and to the point where a lot of people kind of retrospectively see it as, including myself, see it as a little bit overrated. But that still isn't to take away from the fact that it is a real joy to listen to. It's really unique, even if certain parts of it do sound a little bit dated. It's the parts that do sound dated are kind of in an endearing way, I think, in retrospective. Like, there's, especially for me, because this is an incredibly nostalgic album for me. Like, just hold on one second.
No.
This is a copy of the first CD I ever bought with my own money, which is this album, obviously. And My dad had this record on cassette growing up, and it would be one of the many car cassette staples because my dad never had a CD player in his car. He only had a cassette player. So if we ever wanted to listen to music in the car, you had to rip it off the CD or wherever, and usually off of a CD onto a cassette tape expressly for the purpose of the car, because this was not a car that had an aux cable or a CD player. So anyway, long story short, listened to a lot of cassettes growing up. A lot of them were made, but one of them that wasn't was Screamadelica. So Screamadelica was on rotation a lot in my childhood, and it was really influential in developing a lot of what I appreciate about rock music and dance music from this era, and fusing them into this kind of hybrid beast of a record that moves from this really kind of joyous, like kind of gospel inspired rock and roll Rolling Stones-esque song, like Moving On Up, and then into something like Slip Inside This House, which is super dubby, super jungly, super kind of ambient house dub music, crazy shit. Like you can get whiplash moving from one song to the next on this record, but it's always a kind of exciting form of whiplash that even when the record doesn't nail every execution, it's always like giving you a new flavor of itself that makes it so kind of accessible, and I think quite captivating as a first listen experience record as well. We talk a lot on this series about, or on our podcast in general, about albums that maybe take a few listens to really get your head around. And even though this is kind of a crazy, chaotic album, I think it's an album that, and its reputation and success speaks to this, has a really kind of immediate appeal to it when you listen to it. It's just really engaging. I'm curious to hear what your experiences are with it.
One sec, before we get to that success, it is worth mentioning this was the album that actually won the first ever Mercury Prize.
That's right, yes. Well, that is
welcome to the Mercury Prize podcast.
Yeah. Yes.
And I mean, that makes... Sorry.
No, you go. I'm just shit posting.
I mean, I was just going to say, like, that makes a lot of sense given the kind of music that the Mercury Prize sort of tends to go for. Like they just announced the last one of being Arlo Parks Collapse in Sunbeams, which is a record that I'm very fond of. But again, that's like a very like keyed in to a very particular popular British scene that is developing and has a lot of critical acclaim as well. And I feel like Screamadelica occupies a similar niche around the time it was created.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that has been like used as a stick to wield against this record as well, is that it's kind of like trying to do all of these things in really basic ways, like, and trying to like have its cake and eat it too, and not being, yeah, well, there you go, not being a visual aid. Like I've seen criticisms of this record that state that it is like too, like, how's the best way to put this? Like too straight, too simple in its executions of the sort of genres that it goes at. And I can kind of understand that to a certain extent. Like it's not particularly committal to any of the styles that it apes, but it does them in a kind of loving pastiche way. And it stitches them together at certain points in ways that feel quite warm and beautiful to me. And even if it is a kind of like sun-drenched, artificial quality that it has, it's still really fun and engaging, I think.
Yeah, it's easy to see. I think that like when we do, the 1991 retrospective, we talk about how this music influenced stuff like that. And like, regardless of the genre execution thing, which personally I don't know a whole lot about, I just kind of listened to this album in a vacuum and was like, damn, this shit hard. And really, when you listen to it, it's kind of like the broadest term I can come up for is that it's pretty psychedelic the whole way through. And actually, one of the comparisons I drew directly with it in the way it kind of fuses some elements of like broader psychedelia and kind of a gospel and also vague like space rock things, that it reminded me a lot of what Spiritualized would go on to do, particularly with laser guided melodies, and in particular, Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space, which a lot of those songs have the same vibe to. Come Together, a song on that album, is a really like, you could slip that in onto this record with very, very relative ease. I mean, and there is a song on here called
being that they're these records both have that song title used in them.
Yes.
And because like on the Spiritualized record, it's kind of used ironically because that's a song
Yes.
about like drug abuse and like being at your lowest. And here it's kind of like, it's like entirely sincere, and it's used as like a kind of not metaphor, but like this record is based in genres of music that have been historically about like people kind of coming together and celebrating. And so it's like, and on the song Come Together, you have on the UK version anyway, which is the version that you should all have heard on most issues of the album that have been released, you have samples from Jesse Jackson extolling the virtues of gospel and various genres of music coming together. And it's kind of like a commentary on what Primal Scream are doing with this album, which is like piecing together all of these forms of music to find a unity that then is this kind of, you know, blunt but straightforward metaphor for, you know, a wider unity that the music represents as well.
In that respect, I think it's quite comparable to a record we've covered, Graceland. Not exactly, you know, in sound or anything, but I think in ethos, it's pretty much just like the whole genre unification idea. And, you know, it's probably executed with a little bit more grace on that album. But here, I still think that under like the broad sort of genre terms, like, yeah, there's lots of different ideas on this record, but I never see them as being all that disparate, or I don't see them as being like clashing, because it has the same effect. There's lots of things that are very, you know, they do have that sort of psychedelic appeal or a spacier appeal, or just like a kind of dancey appeal. Something like Don't Fight It, Feel It, or Inner Flight even, which, you know, they appeal to something very, God, I can't believe I'm going to do this again. It's not intentional, I swear, but it's very primal. It's something that gets at the part of you that really just wants to dance. Yeah. And, you know, it does it to varying degrees of effectiveness. I don't really know all that much about like dub music or whatever, but personally, the sort of sore thumb track to me of being like the weakest part of the album is Higher Than the Sun, a dub symphony in 2 parts, which, not to immediately go into a weakness of the record, but that part of the album to me has always been a bit more like, it's felt in the sense that like the only issue I had with this, and I talked about really liking this album when I had heard it a couple of months back, is that I do really, really love this album. That said, I'm a little glad that Tyler said, you prefaced it with feeling that this album is a little bit overrated, so that I won't, or maybe everyone will still dogpile me for saying this, but like, this album's just a little bit too fucking long, and I really, really feel like if you shaved off just a little bit on like every song, like if you shaved off like a minute of every song here, I think the album is just uniformly better. I feel like there's a lot of these songs that are in like the 5 to 6 minute area, and they don't really need to be that long, because a lot of them have these repeating passages, and they have that sort of psychedelic effect where it's sort of meant to be more of a mood. It's meant to be something to get you moving, and it does. And sometimes it just feels, it leads it to feeling a little bit baggy. So especially something like Dub Symphony, where it feels like it's a little bit lighter on musical ideas for me, or something like, even something I enjoy like Don't Fight It, Feel It, is still a song where it's like a little bit, some elements of the mix of this song like bother me, and so it's repetition over and over and over again, like one little part of it will just kind of be a little bit tiny bit grating. But largely that's not to put like all the negative things at the front here. I think this is a broadly very, very enjoyable album that mixes together tons of different stuff and makes it feel like it is cohesive. Like all of these genres and infusions that it's doing, it is definitely doing. But when you're listening to it in the moment, you might not necessarily like be able to identify or point that out, because the album does a good job of synthesizing it. And as to whether or not it's a basic way of doing all of that, I can't speak to, because I'm not that musically storied with all of these things, and like obviously. But for me, it works mostly because of the fact that it's really, really fucking fun, and it has a density to its sound too that's just really, really appealing.
I just want to highlight the fact that I just love those repeating musical passages, because it feels like you build and build and put, like, if you have that, they hit on so many hooks. that don't wear out upon endless repetitions, and you build the sorry, hit my lamp, and you build the joy on the joy on the joy of the great hooks repeated again and again, and it's euphoric.
I think it's also part of the kind of dance and trance elements of this record as well, where the longer pieces tend to not wear out for me, with the exception of the Dub Symphony, which I share Jake's kind of reticence to fully engage. I have a fondness for it because, again, like I just heard this record so much as a kid, and that really kind of weird, eerie quality to that Dub Symphony, plus the bass part from Jar Wobble, who is incidentally one of the greatest bass players of all time, famously played with Public Image Limited. But that bass part combined with the real sort of jungle qualities of parts of it, I really enjoy. What it is, though, is it is a remix, and it feels weird to put a 7-minute remix on an album rather than just letting it be a remix apart from the album.
Feels like one. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Like the musical ideas that are in it, I like. I just think that it's strange to just use a remix on this record to express them. I think that the jungly aspects and the Jar Wobble bass playing could have been better utilized in an original composition. So that's my gripe with it. And I actually kind of agree with you to a certain extent on Don't Fight It, Feel It. Not one of my highlights either. And I think one of the parts of the record where the genre fusion aspect is a little kind of, the seams are a little rustier than other parts of this record. But I think at this point, it's probably worth, I'm surprised we've gone this long without doing it, but the biggest song from this record, the kind of central fulcrum point that this record is often, when people think of this record, they often think of this track, is Loaded, the song at the center of this album, with that great sort of like, descending melodic line and general kind of jungly beat
want to get loaded
into it. That is kind of like,
I know it from The World's End, where it features very prominently.
Yeah, it's in a ton of movies. Like I feel like I'm biased here, but I'm pretty sure this is like one of the most played songs of its whole time. Like this thing was a hit, and the thing is, like, it's a perfect and very simple execution of what this record is going for, which is this kind of like rock and roll history that's and Rolling Stones-esque bluesy stuff infused into this kind of bedrock of dancier, more modern sounds, and communicating a feeling of kind of like transcendent joy. Which is interesting because like this record isn't universally joyous. Like there are some kind of more bluesy, dour songs on it, but when this record really hits that joyful, radiant note that it does on songs like Loaded, you really get this album, and you get why it is the way that it is and why people love it.
I have to say, I must parrot a lot of the kind of criticisms that Jake has come at this record with, that some of that, if you're not into a bit of what it's doing, that can really grate on you because of those belabored run times at points, those just small moments that sound exceptionally dated in ways that are some charming, because a lot of this record, I feel it's a record where when I tried to listen to it and take notes, I just had the inclination kind of not to, just because I found myself so kind of engaged in it. And I think that's really its best feature, that it is so immediate, so hooky, and so engaging in the moment, that I think the experience itself is just one of sheer like groove and joy. And the other thing is that a lot of the influences here are pretty obviously worn on these guys' sleeves. Like the blues parts have a lot of Rolling Stones in them. And as with Loaded, I think a lot of the point of this record is kind of that those influences are so well worn. It feels like this kind of culmination and tribute to British culture, not only just the baggy Madchester scene, but also just the totality of British artists like the Stones, the Beatles, and taking that psychedelia and that blues and fusing it together in this interesting kind of genre package.
Yeah, even the kind of like, you know, more dour and darker moments of this record, like Damage, which is like a straight kind of like heartland blues ballad, and I'm Coming Down, which is a song that I'm particularly fond of because it has this really great sort of like rippling I think saxophone line that
Yeah.
I just really like love that shit. I don't know. And so there are these kind of like more dour and darker moments, but they're like such loving pastiches of the little genres that they belong to that you don't really get a kind of sadness out of them. Like I really, really, even though I acknowledge that it's very cheesy, I'm very enamored with Damaged. I just find it to be a really like kind of heartfelt song. And I also think that a lot of what goes a long way to this record's power, and an element we haven't discussed yet is Bobby Gillespie's voice, which is
Yeah.
Oh
incredibly
yeah.
incredibly powerful, and like he uses in very different ways
Versatile.
throughout this record. Versatile is
he's got a
exactly the right word
great
as well.
range to what
Like
to his singing.
and so he utilizes that, and it elevates songs like Damaged and songs like Moving On Up from just feeling like little genre pastiches into genre pastiches that also have a lot of heart and soul in them, which I think sells them ultimately at the end for me. And
absolutely. The loving, the degree of love that is put into this album, kind of love and reverence, I think is what is so ultimately captivating about it, that you never feel like they are never like, disingenuous or parodic. It's just like, we love this type of music and want to make our best possible version of it, because and that's another important thing. I don't think, even though their influences are so blatant, they ever just sound like their influences. They total up to being Primal Scream, not like whoever on any given track. It's I think that aspect is very respectable.
I think it's also a testament to them as well that this is more beside the point, but they never made another album that sounds like this. They are a very consistently evolving genre-bending band. And I feel like even though this record has some seams that it brushes up against and some limitations, and it probably is a little bit long. And I'm definitely a little bit biased against that criticism because I'm so used to this record and getting swept up in it. But also at the same time, it's so endearing. We haven't even talked about my favorite song on this album yet, which isn't necessarily one of the more genre bendy songs, but feels like the absolute perfect distillation of the kind of psychedelic dub house music sort of thing that Primal Scream and Weatherall are going for on this record, which is the original Higher Than the Sun, which is an utterly just gorgeous piece of music. Ever since I first heard this record as a kid, and still now, it's been the song I've always been the most taken by. It's so unique, it's so soulful, it's so like dark and eerie, but also like it'll rise from that dark eeriness to these kind of like radiant moments, and where there's kind of like trilling horns come through and the vocals are just swirling, and it's such a curious and strange and beguiling combination of sounds, and it feels very much like the psychedelic house aspect of this record perfected in a little 3.5 minute song. I'm really fond of that, and I think that's gone down as one of the most enduring Primal Scream songs as well.
I would like to say that that's the end of probably my favorite 3-track run on the thing. I think the 1-2 punch of Moving On Up and Slip Inside This House are just the record at its very fucking best, especially Slip Inside This House, which has this weird, like, groovy psychedelic quality to, oh god, it's so like warm and weird, and I can't fucking get enough of that song.
It has this like distorted like sitar sound in it. And it almost sounds like the vocals are being processed through it. It's really strange. And again, it's very dubby, it's very housey. I love that track as well. There's even like this weird squally it's just a little tiny wee squally guitar solo tucked into it at a certain point that it just is like the icing on the cake. Beautiful. Love that shit.
Whenever brass of any kind on this album shows its head, it's just like, oh yeah, let's dance, motherfucker.
Yeah, totally.
Hey Morgan, what you think this record?
I thought it was fine. Just, dance music is already kind of not always a thing that I am 100% on board for. And when it's sort of often meeting the halfway point with that and late 60s English rock and roll. I'm, it is a cocktail for me to be like, yeah, all right, I get it. I think, fun. And that's pretty much my thoughts entirely on this. There's not really anything on it that I didn't enjoy, and there's nothing on it that I loved outright. It's very slick sounding, very nice to listen to. It gets the people going, and I admire that.
I'm very glad we got to cover it on this retrospective. I feel like it's sort of a niche of music that we wouldn't normally interact with on this podcast. I'm really glad to get to cover it when we do.
Yeah, it's definitely not like anything else we've reviewed for the retrospective by a pretty wide margin. I mean, like,
yeah, or even really on like a record club or something,
You know what's funny is that the closest thing in terms of musical DNA to this that we reviewed is the Orbital album, Insides.
Yeah.
Because that comes from the acid techno world that Weatherall is a big part of. So, but yeah, that is a totally different album to this in like most every way, apart from that vague shared DNA.
And yet one that I was also like, hey, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think Morgan, you just have this kind of weird distance from certain strains of British music.
Yeah, it's the fucking English. That's all I can discern.
But I know you love the Stone Roses first album.
British.
So
yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah, but
there's exceptions to the overall.
Yeah, but the Stone Roses also has like so much new wave and an eventual, what sounds like Britpop influence now, but it was really like proto Britpop.
Yeah.
Like in addition to the,
Yeah, Britpop, I guess, was kind of like one strain that evolved out of the whole kind of Madchester scene and ended up taking. I mean, you could probably do a really rich, interesting historical analysis of that. But yeah, amazing record. Shout out as well as kind of my closing statement as well, a song that I absolutely love that's kind of just tucked away on this record that no one ever really talks about. And that is the closing track on here, Shine Like Stars, which is
it's a good one.
Which is like this beautiful little music box epilogue to this album. I love that little kind of wee dun 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 melodic thing that's happening, and what sounds like, I don't know my music, my instruments well enough, but it sounds like a kind of processed accordion or like something of that ilk that's kind of wheezing across this song. There's something really tender about it and even sad a little bit, and it just has this real kind of childhood attachment to me because I can remember again listening to this tape a lot in the car. And there's this, I think it's quite interesting that this record ends on this really sort of like tender note. Like the second half of this record generally, after Loaded, gets much more sort of like emotional and moves away from some of the more extreme genre fusions. And I think I like that it ends in this kind of more plaintive place as a kind of like come down to the trip of the first half and of the majority of this record. I think it is a long record for sure. It could certainly be cut down. I could do completely without the song Inner Flight, to be honest, but still it has a great sense of pacing to it in spite of that flaw. And I like the journey that it takes you on in terms of like moving through a drug trip and ending in this kind of like serene place of faded high, and it is just it makes you want to get up and dance. It makes you want to take pills. It makes you want to just crash, and it makes you want to lie under the sun. And I love the simplicity of this cover art. I love this kind of like child's drawing of a sun with these eyes and the absence of text as well. Like
the Cure's Wish has always reminded me of that, and how it's just like fucking just a kid with crayon.
Yeah, but like it's that, but also like when you listen to this record, I imagine like laying under the sun or laying under like really kind of artificial bright neon lights, and this kind of very artificial child's drawing of the sun feels like it kind of gets at that feeling in an abstract way. Again, I'm reading into it a lot here, but I've still had a lot of time in my life to look at this cover and think about it, and I just love it for its simplicity and the fact that it feels so perfect for this record. Okay, well, favorite tracks and ratings then?
Yeah,
for Primal Scream's Screamadelica. I'll go first to do our reverse order thing. My 3 favorite songs on this record are Higher Than the Sun, absolutely the number one. Second place, Come Together, which I think is a perfect centerpiece of this record, as I said, and basically encompasses the whole ethos of it while just banging. And yes, I do feel that the 10 minutes are justified. Although I will say that if you do feel that this track is too long, the US version is actually 2 minutes shorter, but it does lose the Jesse Jackson samples, which I think are integral and awesome. And
it's one of the best songs on the record.
Firmly embedded into the DNA of my childhood musical experience, laying in the car going, we know that music is music, gospel, rhythm, and blues, and jazz, all those are just labels. On a loop in my head forever.
Genre is just a word.
Gospel. Anyway, yes, Come Together and Shine Like Stars as well. My 3 favorite tracks. Shout out to I'm Coming Down To, which is a close 4th place. Least favorite is Inner Flight, and this record gets a 7.5 from me.
I don't, man. So my favorite tracks are Loaded, Damaged, and I don't really get to talk about it much, but I generally think Moving On Up is just one of my favorite songs of the whole 90s. It's just so full of joy and life, and I love it. Least favorite, probably Don't Fight It, Feel It. It's getting an 8.5 from me.
I will say Come Together, Higher Than the Sun, and Don't Fight It, Feel It. Sure, why not? My least favorite is probably Damaged. Not because it's like cheesy or anything, but it suffers from what a lot of these songs suffer from, is that it's too long, and I'm not 100% into it to begin with. So, and I will give this a 6.5.
Nice.
Give you a 6.5.
My favorite tracks here are Loaded, Moving On Up, and probably Come Together. Least favorite on here, I don't know, Don't Fight It, Feel It. It's a tougher call for me. I generally enjoy most of the material on here. I would give it a 6.5.
My 3 favorite tracks are Moving On Up, Slip Inside This House, and Come Together, which no matter how much I do love that song a whole lot, I can't help but imagine the spiritualized Come Together in my head whenever I think about it, just because God.
I mean, definitely, I love Come Together to bits, but I love the Primal Scream one to bits, but the spiritualized song is an all-timer.
I agree. It is It is the best song called Come Together. My least favorite
say, at least
song,
nobody's mentioned the fucking Beatles.
No, it's much better.
Old dumb baby ass.
He come grooving up slowly. He got
eyeballs. He got holy rollers. He got hair down.
I just shouldn't have fucking said anything.
This is what my personal. This is what my ring in hell is like. This is what.
Okay,
it is.
my least favorite song.
Almost entirely self-inflicted.
My least favorite song is Higher Than the Sun, parentheses, a dub symphony in 2 parts, more like an L symphony in 2 parts. Am I right, fellas? And I give the album a 7.5.
Brutal.
That joke was an L.
God has cursed me for my hubris, and my work is never finished.
Oh, Jesus.
Every week is a Sisyphusian task. It says a 7.3 average. It's what we also gave to Play With Toys. It's an album that deserves more, in my opinion. Shape and Destroy and English Settlement, both very good records.
Mm-hmm. I want to take this opportunity as well, because I probably won't have another chance to do this, to recommend some of the other records of Primal Scream.
I was going to actually ask you to do that, Tyler.
Because this is not even in their 3 best records, in my opinion. It's so that's part of the kind of overrated thing where I don't mean to say I don't think it's a good album. As I've said, I really care for this album a lot, but I think they've got better. And I particularly want to recommend their album Exterminator, which is very different to this. It's kind of like an electro industrial noise rock big beat electronic album that's very kind of late 90s early 2000s, but in the best way possible. Like, and it has this sort of confusion of like My Bloody Valentine-esque shoegaze with really kind of noisy electronic stuff. It's very like garish and ugly sounding, but like in an appealing way, if that makes sense. And it has a lot of their best, it has their best song on it, which is called Keep Your Dreams, but it has a lot of their best songs on it, as well as the song Accelerator, which is simply one of the loudest songs ever made by anyone. So yeah, Exterminator is highly recommended from me. Absolutely their best album. And their other records, Vanishing Point and Evil Heat, are super underrated as well. But I mean, if you listen to one Primal Scream record, then listen to Exterminator. And if you happen to like, I don't think this will be anyone here, but if anyone at home happens to like the bluesier / heartland rock side of Screamadelica a bit more than anything else, then I recommend the album that came after it, Give Out But Don't Give Up, which is basically like a late period Rolling Stones record, but with the particular vocal stylings of Bobby Gillespie. It's not an amazing album, but I think it's also kind of an underrated record, so it deserves a little bit more love. So yeah, this discography was a big discography of my childhood. My dad had the compilation album Dirty Hits, which was like all of their best songs from their 90s and 2000s records, and so another band I'm intimately familiar with. And Exterminator, so yeah, Exterminator and Evil Heat come highly recommended from me if you want more of this band.
Exterminator has the song called Swastika Eyes on it.
Yes. Yeah, that is, I think, is that the one?
And
that
Kill All Hippies is the opening track.
Yes. Yeah, that's got actually two versions of the song Swastika Eyes on it, because one of them is remixed by the Chemical Brothers, who are a big influence on this record. So yeah. No, dope album. It's really like one of those records that doesn't try to be like a perfectly crafted record. Like, it's not afraid to just be fucking ugly, and it does that in a really appealing way, but it might completely throw you off. I think Kevin Shields of My Bloody Valentine is on this record as well. So there you go. Anyway, Screamadelica. Let us know what Screamadelica means to you at home. Do you think it's the best Primal Scream record? Do you have other favorites? Let us know. What do you think of the strengths and weaknesses of this record? Speak now in the comments section below. Make sure you remember to like and subscribe if you have not already, and check out the playlist of the other records we've covered in our 1991 retrospective. That'll be in the link below. Next week, we're going to be talking about probably the biggest album of 1991, which is Nirvana's Nevermind. Going to be a really interesting video to do, reflecting on that record's legacy and this particular podcast's, let's say, unique perspective.
When Tyler is king, Morgan and I will be up against the wall with our opinions that are of no consequence.
It's going to be fucking messy. Get ready.
It's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. So stick around for that. Make sure you also go and check out the other videos we've put out this week. We reviewed the new Kanye West album and the new Little Sims album. We also did a record club on Tim Buckley's Star Sailor. So we're really traversing the genre spectrum this week. Make sure you go and check those out. But
Chaos reigns.
With all being said and done, I'll leave it to August to send us out.
As always, everyone, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Time Warner, enjoy better.